You are watching The World 24/7 on the NDTV network. I'm Parmeshwar Bawa. Let's begin with the headlines we're tracking at the moment. Well, on the eve of his visit to Ukraine, Prime Minister Modi has said that India was a supporter of peace in this region, as he reiterated that this is not an era of war and any conflict should be resolved through diplomacy and dialogue. US Democratic Vice Presidential nominee Tim Walz and former President Bill Clinton are headlining the Democratic National Convention's third day as the party hopes to build on the momentum that Kamala Harris has brought since joining the race a month ago. Well, Chinese Premier Li Qiang, who met Russia's Vladimir Putin in Moscow on Wednesday, has said the country's relations are at an unprecedentedly high level. Masked police officers in Romania carried out fresh raids at the home of divisive internet influencer Andrew Tate, who is awaiting trial on charges of human trafficking, rape, and forming a criminal gang to sexually exploit women. SpaceX is gearing up to launch what is being billed as a risky mission that could see the first spacewalk ever conducted by private citizens. Well, our big focus, this is not an era of war, our Prime Minister has reiterated while addressing the Indian community in Poland 2 days before his much-anticipated visit to Ukraine, where he has pledged to campaign for a peaceful resolution of Russia's invasion. As we have been reporting, this is the first ever visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Ukraine since its independence in 1992, and the trip to Ukraine will take place in the midst of Kiev's military gamble to take the offensive into the Kursk region, which is its first incursion into Russian territory since the start of the war back in 2022. But when Modi arrived in Moscow on the 9th of July, Ukrainian cities had been under multiple missile strikes, with one of the targets hit being the largest children's hospital in Kiev. But as you know, India has consistently refrained from directly criticizing Russia for the invasion of Ukraine and has abstained from UN resolutions condemning Moscow. However, as a country, India has sought to balance its stance by emphasizing the need for peaceful resolution of armed conflicts, the prevention of civilian casualties, and the unobstructed delivery of humanitarian aid. Listen in to what Prime Minister Modi had to say in Poland, followed by my colleague Vishnu Shom's ground report.
भारत हमेशा फर्स्ट रिस्पॉन्डर के रूप में सामने आता है और इसलिए भारत इस रीजन में भी स्थायी शांति का एक बड़ा पैरोकार है। भारत का मत एकदम साफ है, ये युद्ध का युग नहीं है।
I'm at the Maidan Square in the heart of Kiev in Ukraine. Behind me are flags, the Ukrainian flag, each one symbolizing the loss of a soldier who's been killed in this war, which is now stretched for well more than 900 days. The visit of Prime Minister Modi over here is highly anticipated. I've been speaking to Ukrainian leaders who do know that India has a close association with Russia. Could that be a possible avenue to getting to Vladimir Putin, to get into a discussion which is on favorable terms? Whether India can actually go this far or not, we don't know. Whether there is a real out-of-the-box solution which the Prime Minister has or not, we do not know. But the visit of the Prime Minister is significant nonetheless at a time when he was in Moscow just a couple of weeks back. No other leader in the world of his stature, of his seniority, has been over here in Ukraine or will be here in Ukraine and has been in Moscow And that really does symbolize the independence of Indian foreign policy, that you are equally comfortable in Kiev or in Moscow, two countries which are waging a war. The big question is, can there be a peace? Because people are tired, the loss of lives, tens of thousands of lives has been absolutely immense, which is why this war genuinely needs to come to an end as soon as possible. So do keep joining us on NDTV as we track the visit of the Prime Minister, his visit coming up in Ukraine. But before that very important visit, he is in Warsaw at the moment. India and Poland looking to step up the bilateral relationship, step up economic ties, and also reflect on a common historic past. In Kiev, Vishnu Shom for NDTV. The visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Ukraine is one that's being watched very closely all across the world, certainly over here in Ukraine. We're joined now by a very special guest. Alexander Kornienko is the first deputy chairperson of the Ukrainian Parliament. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us. Are you looking forward to the visit of Prime Minister Modi?
Of course, we wait this very historical visit for our country, and I think not only for our bilateral relationship, but even for all over the world.
Ukraine has always spoke about the importance of European security and joining the European Union. How is that still a big priority for Kiev?
It's our biggest priority, joining an accession to EU. It's our biggest and the main priority right now. I'm a member of negotiation team of our country, like representative of our parliament on high level. And every day we have meetings, calls, different discussion inside our country. And of course, when the Euro Commission will return from vacation, our process will be very active. We have very huge ambitions to go through this pathway of accession, not in 10 years, not in 20 years, of course, maybe in 5 years, and
sure.
2, 3, 5 years. Of course, a very important part of our integration to EU, our accession, will be security issue.
Yes.
We understand that for EU, it start to be very, very sensitive question last years. Because of this full-scale invasion Russia to Ukraine, but because also about the security situation.
Well, with that, let's turn our attention to the other big story we're tracking coming out of Chicago. The Minnesota Governor Tim Walz will take the stage tonight in Chicago to formally accept his nomination as Kamala Harris's pick for Vice President and introduce himself to voters on a scale like no other. It is a critical introduction. While a subsection of the internet has embraced Tim Walz as a Midwestern dad figure, about 4 in 10 Americans actually say they still don't know enough about the former geography teacher to form a strong opinion of him. This is what AP has reported as well. Now, though he ranks high in favorability generally with Democrats, he's still lacking with several key Democratic coalitions, is what we can pick up on. And the vice presidential nominee Tim Walz, as well as former President Bill Clinton, are the headliners on the third day of the DNC, as the party hopes to build on the momentum that Kamala Harris has brought since joining the race a month ago. Tim Walz, by the way, also became the target of Republican criticism over how he's portrayed his National Guard service as well as his personal story.
Being inside Trump's White House was terrifying. But what keeps me up at night is what will happen if he gets back there. The guardrails are gone. The few adults in the room the first time resigned or were fired.
I am excited to see what she does for healthcare. I am a pharmacist, and every single day I see Americans suffer to pay for medications out of pocket, and it's really heartbreaking. I am worried about her policy regarding Palestine and Gaza. I feel like she does a lot of talk, and then the next day the policy just doesn't coincide with her opinion the day before.
Well, meanwhile, the third day of the DNC kicked off with a first of its kind Vedic prayer where the priest sought blessings for a united country. Listen in.
Truth is our foundation and always prevails. Lead us from unreal to real, from darkness to the light, and from death.
Right, we have with us Voice of America's White House Bureau Chief, Patsy Widakuswara, joining us. Thanks so much, Patsy, as always, for making time for us. Well, it's game night for Coach Walz. Patsy, am I audible to you?
Yes, now I can hear you. Go ahead.
Right, I was saying it's game night for Coach Walz. In fact, polling shows that early hiccups that Tim Walz has seen, even in comparison to that, Walz has had a much smoother launch when we compare his record to his running mate, Republican J.D. Vance.
Yes, absolutely. That's true. What you said earlier about Tim Walz being accepted wholeheartedly by most Democrats is absolutely true. You can feel it here. You can feel the energy and the enthusiasm. And as you say, he's a very memeable figure. And he is really good with these zingers that put down his opponents. The larger question is whether or not Americans will have enough time to get to know him. There is less than 80 days to the election, and that's not a lot of time to introduce someone to the rest of the country. And this is his big debut. So what we know so far of Tim Walz, you've already outlined some of it, his service in the National Guard, his background as a teacher, as a former coach. And as he characterized himself, he is this Midwestern dad. And this is certainly something that Democrats try to highlight as they try to provide a counter to this kind of toxic masculinity narrative that many critiques of the Make America Great movement under Donald Trump tries to attach to that part of the conservative base. So what they're offering, what the Democrats are offering, is this counter narrative of Tim Walz as a helpful male to female cause, as somebody who's not insecure and not afraid to play a supporting role to a strong woman. So it'd be really interesting to see and listen to his speech tonight.
Right. Patsy, also, like many say, this is not 2016 or 2020. The stakes are much higher. But many Americans believe that they had actually never heard of Tim Walz until Harris chose him to join the ticket. In fact, in his first few weeks of campaigning, I want to ask you, has he been able to charm supporters with his background as a teacher and football coach? Has he been able to help balance Harris's coastal background as a cultural representative of Midwestern states whose voters she needs this fall?
Certainly for Democrats and certainly for young progressive Democrats, right? I mean, he is just all over social media right now. But the question is, the rest of the country who's not so tuned in on Instagram, who's not so tuned in on YouTube and all these channels where Tim Walz is becoming this just popular memeable figure alongside with these other, coconut memes and other snippets that influencers put on social media. Influencers, by the way, have a really special spot here at the Democratic National Convention. I was just walking around earlier and I saw this lounge. About 200 social media influencers were invited by the White House and by the Harris campaign to come and produce content from the DNC. And they are getting, to be honest, a lot better treatment than we, the actual press, the actual media are getting. So this is certainly something that shows you how much the Harris campaigns underscores the strength of social media in this particular election cycle. And yes, you're absolutely right. Is Tim Walz going to be able to charm the rest of the country? That is the big question and the big homework for Democrats and the Harris campaign.
Right. The week in Chicago's United Center, it has been a balancing act for Harris and other Democrats. But Patsy, you were mentioning that there's a bit of a star lineup of performers. Take us through the plan of action.
Yeah, so the big keynote speaker other than Tim Walz is, of course, Bill Clinton.
Yes.
He is there to showcase the continuity of, former Democratic presidents supporting Kamala Harris. We had Barack Obama yesterday. We had, of course, Joe Biden earlier this week, as well as, Jason Carter. He's the grandson of Jimmy Carter, who is now 99 years old and is unable to speak on stage. But as far as performers go, there's Stevie Wonder, there is John Legend. We are going to have Pink tomorrow. So this is, of course, something that Democrats are really proud of. And they try to contrast that with the experience at the Republican National Convention last month, where you don't see former Republican presidents. You don't even see former Trump administration officials. What you see is a lineup of Trump family members. So this is something that Democrats want to highlight. There is continuity. There is support from the entertainment industry coming out here in Chicago tonight.
Well, the Democrats want to harness the exuberance that has swept over their party since Joe Biden stepped aside, while also making clear to their supporters that the election will be a fierce fight. As always, Patsy Veerakuswara, thank you so much for joining us with the latest from the DNC in Chicago.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, meanwhile, John Pollen and Rachel Goldberg Pollen, the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Pollen, brought many tears to the Democratic National Convention and the audience there as they paid tribute to their son, who is still being held by Hamas after its October 7th attack.
At this moment, 109 treasured human beings are being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. They are Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. They are from 23 different countries. The youngest hostage is a 1-year-old red-headed baby boy, and the oldest is an 86-year-old mustachioed grandpa. Among the hostages are 8 American citizens. One of those Americans is our only son. His name is Hirsch.
Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve appears to be very much on track for an interest rate cut in September after a vast majority of officials said such an action was likely, according to the minutes of the US Central Bank's July 30th and 31st meeting. Now, the minutes, which were released on Wednesday, even showed some policymakers would have been willing to reduce borrowing costs at last month's gathering. But the policy-setting Federal Open Market Committee left its benchmark interest rate unchanged in the 5.25% to 5.50% range on the 31st of July, but opened the door to a cut at the 17th to 18th September meeting. Well, with that, we're slipping into a very short break. News and updates continue in a moment. Do stay tuned. Well, Iran's parliament approved President Masoud Pezeshkian's 19 ministers, giving way to a cross-factional cabinet, reflecting his focus on consensus after days of debate. In fact, all 19 officials won approval in an afternoon vote, the first time that's happened in Iran since the year 2001. But in contrast to former President Ibrahim Raisi's hardline team, the new cabinet includes reformist figures such as Health Minister Mohammad Reza Zafarkandi, who secured his position despite receiving the lowest number of votes at 163. Approval of the ministerial lineup is not a formality, though. One minister proposed in 2021 by Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash in May, lost the confidence vote due to lacking experience, meaning a different name had to be drafted in. But Farzaneh Sadegh was approved as Minister of Roads and Transportation, becoming only the second female cabinet minister since the Islamic Republic's establishment in 1979. Mohsen Paknejad was approved as Minister of Oil. He served as Deputy Minister of Oil for the supervision of hydrocarbon resources from 2018 to 2021. The oil minister told Parliament he would actively pursue the issue of joint fields with neighboring countries and boost oil output to 4 million barrels per day by March 2025. Abbas Araghchi, meanwhile, was approved as Minister of Foreign Affairs with 247 votes after convincing parliamentarians wary of his key role in negotiating Tehran's 2015 nuclear agreement with 6 world powers. Now, during deliberations with the parliament, Araghchi asserted that he holds the same worldview he held during his time serving with the Revolutionary Guards and expressed support for a 2020 parliamentary bill hardening Iran's nuclear stance. Well, in other news, 4 bodies were retrieved on Wednesday from the sunken wreck of a yacht belonging to the wife of British tech magnate Mike Lynch. This is what the Italian Fire Brigade has confirmed, adding that they were continuing to search for 2 more missing people. The bodies were brought ashore on rescue boats and taken to nearby hospitals for formal identification, but local authorities refused to give any information about who they might have found. But Britain's Daily Telegraph reported that 2 of the dead were Lynch and his 18-year-old daughter, while Italy's local media has said that the only bodies identified so far were Morgan Stanley banker Jonathan Bloomer and US lawyer Chris Morvillo. Well, our other big focus, India and the EU hosted a conference on combating terrorism. This was a 2-day regional conference, and the key focus was on the current and emerging threats as far as online radicalization is concerned. There were wide-ranging discussions held on countering online exploitation, and policymakers, academics, law enforcement officials were all in attendance. My colleague Mohammad Ghazali was tracking this closely. Listen into his report.
I'm joined here by Mr. Marco Teixeira. He's the regional representative for the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime for South Asia region. Thanks, Marcos, for talking to us. I just wanted to ask you first that the drug control is a big challenge, not just for India or South Asian region. What are the thrust areas like you have been focusing on since you've been a representative? You're a representative for the United Nations Drugs Office and Crime.
Thank you for the question. Our work with the governments and non-state actors has been focused on different dimensions, because drugs and crime are an holistic issues that require integrated actions. One of them is at the legislative side, work with the governments to improve their legal frameworks to address drugs and crime. Another dimension is social awareness, how we educate our young children to mitigate vulnerabilities for them to be in contact with drugs and crime and to take wise decisions on not engaging in crime and drugs. And the third element, to work with institutions, how to investigate, prosecute, and actually collect evidence that leads to successful prosecutions and sentences in aspects linked with drugs and crime. This has been part of our work on the region with the governments of the South Asian countries.
Thanks for introducing that. And what has been the region which you feel in your operations after your research and work that has been instrumental, or say the largest contributor for pushing drugs when it comes to South Asia? We have heard of Afghanistan, but what about the other regions we have? Because India has been facing the drug trafficking from Pakistan borders from Bangladesh. So has that also come under discussion with the Indian government?
I think when we look at the statistics of the world drugs production, we see, I would say, in the region, 2 main hubs. Of course, Afghanistan in the past was one of the biggest source of heroin and opioids. Now this has reduced and may be more fluent in methamphetamines. When we look at Myanmar, became now the big source of opium in the region, associated also with other aspects linked with methamphetamine and other amphetamine type stimulants. So I think these two elements are part of the source of the drugs that we see in the region, but we see more and more synthetic drugs laboratories producing in the region that have also an impact on the availability of drugs that we see in this region. So it's a collective effort to disrupt this production of drugs in the region.
How big is this a challenge that we have seen multiple reports contributing to the fact that this drug money is also sort of fueling terrorism and militancy across the border of India? You spoke about Myanmar, that's a disturbed region. We know what is happening in Afghanistan or even in Pakistan. So how do you see this drug money being one of the most major contributor towards fueling extremism or militancy across the Indian border?
Financing of terrorism and our analysis comes from different sources. And in fact, the financing that originates from drug trafficking is also one of the facts that's fueling terrorism-affiliated groups and terrorism activities. Naturally, we try to mitigate this to disrupt the illicit financial flows associated with drugs and also mitigate the way they finance terrorism with the counterterrorism financing strategies that are in place in the region and, of course, working with the governments to mitigate their threats.
Well, thank you for investing your time and watching this edition of The World 24/7 on the NDTV network. We'll keep tracking the latest updates for you. Do stay tuned.